The lark had a broken wing, and Verity Ashworth was telling it, in a voice she had not used in 8 years, that it would live. There now, she said, so low it was barely more than breath shaped into words, her thumb smoothing the feathers along its ruined shoulder. You will fly again. I promise you that, though I have no right to promise anything to anyone. She did not know that the Duke of Ravensmere stood 10 paces off, in the shadow of the yew hedge, arrested mid-stride, and that he would remember the sound of her voice longer than he remembered almost anything else that summer. Had she known, she would have finished what she was saying all the same, because some kindnesses cost too little to withhold even from a bird, and some truths, once loosed, could not be called back into the throat that made them. She was 26 that summer, though the household had long since stopped counting her age, the way one stops counting the years on a piece of good furniture, once it has proved it, will not warp. For 8 years she had been Miss Ashworth, the Dowager Duchess's silent companion, and in all that time not one soul at Ravensmere Hall, not the housekeeper, not the steward, not the Duke himself, had heard her utter a single word. She wrote what needed writing on a small slate that hung from a ribbon at her waist, and she read what needed reading aloud when others could not, and she kept the old Duchess's correspondence in a hand so neat that visitors remarked upon it before they remarked upon anything else about her. She was, by every account the house kept of her, a mute. She was not. She had chosen it, 8 years ago, the way a drowning woman chooses the one plank within reach, and she had held to the choice with both hands ever since, because a silent woman cannot be made to say the word yes before a magistrate. And a silent woman is very hard to sell. The lark shifted in her palms and settled, and she set it in its nest of wool inside the old seed basket. And she rose, brushing down her skirts, and it was only then, turning, that she saw the shape of him against the hedge, and felt the whole summer morning drop out from beneath her feet. She did not gasp. She had trained herself out of gasping the way other women trained themselves into good posture. She merely went very still, the stillness of a woman deciding, in the space of half a breath, exactly how much of herself she could afford to lose. The Duke did not move either. Gideon Traherne was not a man given to sudden motion. He had learned long ago that a still man is harder to read than a bolting one, and there was very little in England he wished to be read for. He was a head taller than most men who called at the Hall, broad through the shoulder in a way his tailors despaired of disguising, with a face that had been called handsome by women who had never once made him laugh and grave by everyone else. His hands, when he finally lifted one in something that was not quite a greeting, were a working man's hands on a duke's wrist, calloused from rain and rail, because he did not trust an estate to stewards alone, not since his brother died, and left him certain that trust was a debt paid, sooner or later, in blood. He looked at Verity a moment longer, and something moved behind his eyes that she could not name. And then, mercifully, unbelievably, he inclined his head as though he had seen nothing at all, and walked on toward the stables, and did not look back. She stood a long while after he had gone, her hand pressed flat against her own throat, feeling her pulse hammering under 2 fingers, and she thought, with the particular clarity of a woman who has kept a ledger her whole life, that she had just 8 years and one careless morning to set against whatever the Duke of Ravensmere chose to do with what he had heard. She did not yet know that in 6 weeks' time, on Michaelmas Day, the family's solicitor was to arrive from London to audit every book the estate kept, and that her own silence, and the estate's books, and the Duke's newly wakened attention were all, without her knowing it, converging toward the same reckoning. She did not see him again until evening, and by then she had rebuilt the wall around herself brick by ordinary brick, had taken her supper standing in the still room as she always did, had carried the Duchess's nightly tonic up on its silver tray, had smoothed the coverlet and set the candle where the old woman liked it, 3 inches from her left hand and no closer. It was the Duke's step on the stair that undid the last of the wall. He did not send for her through a footman, which was itself unlike him. He came himself, and stood in the doorway of the small parlour where she took her rare hour of evening quiet, and he said, without preamble, "You spoke to a bird this morning." She reached for her slate out of 8 years of pure reflex, and then stopped. Because a slate would be, in that particular moment, its own kind of lie, and she found she could not make herself write one more lie in front of a man who had just watched the true shape of her fall out of her own mouth. "Yes," she said instead, and the word came out cracked, unfamiliar, like a door long unused finally forced on its hinge. He did not smile at his small victory, which she would, later, come to understand was the first proof of the kind of man he was. He crossed the room instead, and sat, uninvited, in the chair opposite hers, close enough that she could smell cedar and horse, and the leather of his riding gloves still tucked through his belt. 8 years, he said. My grandmother has kept a mute companion for 8 years, and in 8 years I have never once heard you laugh, or weep, or curse when you dropped a tray, and I confess I had begun to think you a kind of household saint. I find I am relieved to learn you are merely a woman with excellent reasons. You will tell her, Verity said. It was not quite a question. It came out steadier than she had any right to feel. I have not decided what I will tell anyone, he said, which is, I think, more mercy than you were prepared for. I was prepared for none, she said. I keep no ledger for mercy. I did not think to find it here. Something shifted in his face at that, not quite a wince, more the flinch of a man recognizing an old debt called due in an unfamiliar currency, and he said, "Then let us strike a bargain, since you deal in ledgers. I will ask you nothing tonight. You will owe me nothing tonight. But I will know, eventually, why a woman buries her own voice for 8 years. Because I do not believe you did it for love of quiet, and if I never tell you, then I will go on not needing your voice to know your mind," he said, rising, settling his coat with a single economical motion. "Because I have watched you read a room in the time it takes another woman to curtsy, and I have found, Miss Ashworth, that I trust your silences a good deal, more than I trust most men's speeches." He left her with that, and she sat a long while with her hand still pressed to her throat, turning his words over the way she turned coins to check them for clipping, and found to her own considerable alarm that they rang true all the way through. It was Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, who found her still sitting there past midnight, and who did not ask what ailed her, because Mrs. Pruitt had asked Verity exactly one question in 8 years, and had learned, from the silence that answered it, never to ask another. She only set down her candle and said, in the flat Fenbrook vowels she had never bothered to soften for gentry, "A still tongue keeps a safe head, lass. I've said it to you before, and I'll say it again. Only tonight you look like a woman who's forgot it." "I have not forgotten it," Verity said, and Mrs. Pruitt's candle nearly went out of her hand at the sound, though to her enduring credit she did not drop it, only set her jaw and sat down heavily across from her, flower still white in the creases of her knuckles from the morning's baking. "Well," she said, after a moment, in the tone of a woman recalculating a very long sum. "That's that, then. 8 years I've watched you write your bread and butter on a slate, and not once did I let on I minded. Because the day you came to this house half-starved with your father's account book under your arm and a story about a fever that took your voice, I knew inside a fortnight it was no fever. A fever doesn't leave a girl flinching at the word wed like it was a blow." She reached across and took Verity's cold hand in her warm one. "Who's heard you now?" "The Duke," Verity said, and watched the housekeeper's face do several things in quick succession before settling, with visible effort, on calm. "Then you'd best decide, Mrs., Pruitt said, "whether you trust him with the rest of it, because a man who keeps one secret for a woman generally wants to know he isn't the fool holding the only end of the rope." Osric Bellamy came to Ravensmere Hall twice a week to go over the accounts with the old Duchess, and he came, as always, with his cuffs turned back precisely 1 inch and his voice pitched low and warm. The voice of a man who had never in his life needed to raise it to be obeyed. He was the Duke's second cousin, the son of a steward who had managed the estate for 30 years without ever once being asked to sit at the family table, and he had inherited his father's ledgers and his father's office, and, though no one at Ravensmere had troubled to notice it, his father's quiet, permanent arithmetic of grievance. He found Verity in the estate office that same week, copying out the quarter's rent rolls in her careful hand, and he stood over her a moment longer than the work required, watching her pen. "You have a fine hand for figures, Miss Ashworth," he said. "Finer, I think, than a companion generally needs." She looked up at him and said nothing, because saying nothing was, at that hour, still the only thing she knew how to do in front of Osric Bellamy, and he smiled, a smile with nothing unkind in its shape, and everything unkind behind its eyes, and touched 2 fingers to his cuff, straightening a hem that did not need straightening. "It is a pity you cannot tell me where you learned it," he said. "I find myself curious about a great many things concerning you, Miss Ashworth. And I am a patient man. Patience is, in my experience, the only capital a poor relation is ever permitted to keep." He left her with that, and she sat very still after he had gone, because she had, in the 3rd column of that quarter's rolls, found a sum that did not agree with the sum beneath it by £4, 6 shillings, and she had found, in the quarter before that, the very same discrepancy, carried forward as though it belonged there. She did not write it on her slate. She copied it, instead, into the back pages of her father's old account book, the one with the brass corners worn soft with handling, in a private code of her own devising that her father had taught her before debt and shame together stopped his heart. A code for keeping true tallies against false ones. For a merchant's daughter learns early that the numbers a man shows the world, and the numbers that are true, are not always, even in honest houses, the same numbers. Word of the Duke's late visit to the small parlour had, by then, travelled the servants' hall in the particular half-hour it takes gossip to outrun truth, and by supper the scullery maids had the Duke proposing marriage to a mute, and Mrs. Pruitt fielding questions with a dishcloth and a face like a shut door. Lady Cordelia Wynne, calling that same week with her mother to take tea with the Duchess, heard some pale version of it too, and looked at Verity across the drawing-room, with the particular cool assessment of a woman totting up a rival's assets and finding, to her visible irritation, that she could not make the sum come out to nothing. How singular, Cordelia said, to no one in particular, watching Verity refill the teapot without being asked, to keep a girl about the house who cannot even properly thank one. Augusta Traherne, Dowager Duchess of Ravensmere, tapped her cane twice against the floor, which was her signal for silence of a different order entirely, and said, "She thanks me 12 times a day, Cordelia, in ways you have not troubled yourself to learn to read. It is a great deal more than I can say for some who have the full use of their tongues." Verity, pouring, kept her eyes on the tea, and thought, not for the first time, that the old woman was a great deal sharper than her nightly tonic, thick, bitter-smelling, delivered each evening by Mr. Bellamy's own hand from the apothecary in Fenbrook, seemed, of late, to be allowing her to remain. The trouble at Aldecott Farm came at the end of that same fortnight, when the miller's roof gave way in a night of driving rain, and left 3 families sleeping under canvas, and it was Verity who sat up with Gideon past midnight in the estate office, tallying what could be spared from the quarter's funds against what the roof would cost. Because the steward was from home, and someone with a quick hand at figures was needed before morning. 4 families, not 3, she said, sliding the paper across to him, her chalk squeaking faintly where she'd corrected a line. The Hollis girl married in the spring. She and her husband share the end cottage now. He looked up at her, and there was something almost boyish in his surprise, quickly suppressed. "You know my tenants better than my steward does. Your steward does not sit with them of an evening reading them the London papers, because the vicar's wife's eyes are failing," she said, and then heard herself, and went faintly red, because it was the longest unbroken sentence she had spoken aloud to him yet, and it had come out easily, without the old catch in her throat, as though 8 years of silence were a coat she had simply forgotten she was still wearing. He noticed. He always noticed. But he only said, mildly, "Then between the 2 of us we may yet manage to be of some use to Aldecott," and bent back to the figures, and did not remark on it, which she found, unaccountably, more moving than if he had. They worked until the candle guttered low, passing the paper back and forth, his hand brushing hers twice, without either of them commenting on it, and somewhere past 1 o'clock he laughed, a short, startled bark of a sound, entirely unlike the composed low amusement he showed at dinner, when she wrote, rather than said, in the margin beside his figure for roofing slate, "Your steward's arithmetic would embarrass a child of 9. He put his hand over his mouth as though to call the laugh back, and could not, and she thought, watching him, that she had never once heard him laugh in 8 years of living under his roof, and understood, with the peculiar clarity of the very tired, that she had just witnessed something rare enough to be worth remembering. "Tell me one true thing," he said, when the laugh had gone, and left something quieter in its place, "and I will ask nothing further tonight." She turned her father's account-book over once in her hands, an old habit, feeling the worn brass corners under her thumbs. "My guardian meant to marry me to a man 3 times my age to settle a debt my father never truly owed," she said. "I was 17. I left in the night with this book and 4 shillings, and by the time I reached Fenbrook I had discovered that a girl who cannot speak cannot be made to say a vow, and cannot be gossiped about by servants who assume she cannot repeat what she hears, and can, if she is careful, become so much furniture that no one troubles to ask what furniture might want." "And what does the furniture want?" he asked, very low. She did not answer that, not fully, could not yet make herself hand him the one card she was still keeping close, the discrepancy folded into her father's book, the £4 6 that recurred, quarter after quarter, like a stone in a shoe, and he did not press her, only said, "I do not need your voice to know your mind, Miss Ashworth. I have managed 8 years without it, I find I can manage a little longer, and the words settled into her like a coin dropped carefully into a purse. To be spent, she understood even then, at some far more costly hour. Osric Bellamy learned of the mute companion's voice from his own man of business, a sharp-eyed clerk in Fenbrook who had it, third hand, from an apothecary's boy who had it from a scullery maid, and he sat with the knowledge a full day before he decided what to do with it, turning his garnet signet ring round and round on his smallest finger, a habit he was not aware he had. He did not go to the Duke with it. He went instead to the servants' hall on a washing day, when half the house was airing linens and the other half was gossiping over them, and he let fall, in his gentlest voice, that he had always thought it curious a girl could arrive at Ravensmere with no letter of character, no family to vouch for her, and a convenient affliction that happened to make her unfit for questioning under oath. "I do not say she is dishonest," he said, to 3 housemaids who repeated every syllable of it within the hour. "I only observe that a woman clever enough to feign silence for 8 years is clever enough to feign a great many other things, and that this house has given her the run of its books and its correspondence on the strength of nothing but her own performance. By supper it had reached the Duke as a settled fact rather than a rumour, that Miss Ashworth had deceived the household from the first day, that her hand in the ledgers wanted looking into, that a woman who could lie so thoroughly about so simple a thing as her own tongue could hardly be trusted with anything larger. Gideon received it standing in his study, with his fist closed hard against his thigh, the old wound in him, the one that had never fully closed since his brother Julian's horse came home alone 5 years before, since he had learned, too late, that the letter calling him away from that ride on urgent estate business had never truly needed answering that same hour, opening again beneath Bellamy's soft words like a scar under pressure. He did not send for Verity that night. He told himself it was because he needed to think, and did not examine too closely why thinking, for him, so often meant putting a door between himself and the person who might otherwise talk him out of his own fear. She felt the change in him before he ever said a word of it to her, felt it in the way he no longer came to the small parlour of an evening, in the way his eyes, when they crossed hers at dinner, held a question he would not ask, and it was Mrs. Pruitt, wiping her hands on her apron with more force than the task required, who finally told her what the washing-day gossip had made of Bellamy's soft observation. "He's poisoned the well, Lars, and done it so prettily half the house thinks they thought of it themselves," the housekeeper said. "You'll want to speak to the Duke before that man does it again." "And say what?" Verity asked. "That I lied to protect myself. And in protecting myself I have made myself impossible to trust with anything that matters. He is not wrong, Mrs. Pruitt, that is the worst of it. Every word Mr. Bellamy has said is true. I only wish he did not know exactly which true thing would cost me the most to hear repeated." It was 2 days later that Mr. Silas Gray came calling, a mild, prosperous widower from the next county, a friend of Bellamy's these many years, with a comfortable house and a want of a housekeeper who would not talk back, and Bellamy arranged, with the smooth efficiency of a man arranging a sale, to have Verity summoned to the estate office to meet him. "Miss Ashworth," Bellamy said, when Gray had bowed himself out again to inspect the stables, "I have secured for you what I consider a very great kindness. Mr. Gray is a comfortable man. He asks no questions of a quiet wife, and he is prepared to settle £200 upon you the day the banns are read, with a further 100 upon the marriage itself. You would want for nothing. You would trouble this house no further." "And if I decline the kindness?" she asked, and heard her own voice come out flat and even, though her hands, hidden in her skirts, were not steady at all. Then I fear the Duchess's trust in you may not survive the discovery that her companion has been keeping a private cipher in the back of an old account book," Bellamy said, and smiled his gentle smile. And she understood, with a cold drop of the stomach, that he had been into her room, or paid someone who had, and that he knew far more of what she had been quietly gathering against him than she had ever let herself believe possible. £300 and a husband who will never ask you an inconvenient question, he said, against a woman's word, a woman who cannot even give her word aloud, set against mine. Think carefully, Miss Ashworth, about which of us this house is more likely to believe. She thought of the £4, 6 shillings. She thought of the tonic tray, and the old Duchess's hands lately, trembling over her needlework where once they had been steady. She set both hands flat on the desk between them, the way her father used to when closing a difficult sale, and said, "I decline your kindness, Mr. Bellamy," and watched something small and ugly flicker behind his eyes before the gentleness closed back over it like water over a dropped stone. It was 3 days after that when the miniature went missing from the Duchess's dressing table, a small gilt-framed portrait of Gideon's mother, kept always beside the tonic tray, and it was found, within the hour, tucked inside the lining of Verity's own trunk, exactly where a search conducted by Mr. Bellamy's own hand happened to discover it. She did not weep when Gideon came to her with it held out on his open palm, his face carved from something colder than she had ever seen him wear. She only looked at the little portrait, and then at him, and said, "I did not take it," in a voice that came out steadier than her heart had any right to allow, and watched him want, so plainly it was its own kind of pain to witness, to believe her, and watched him fail. "I want to believe you," he said. "I have wanted to believe you since the morning I heard you speak to that bird, and I have found, these last days, that wanting is not the same as being able." "No," she said, "it is not. I have learnt that lesson a good deal longer than you have, your Grace." She packed her father's account book and 4 shillings worth of pride into the same small trunk she had arrived with 8 years before, and left Ravensmere Hall on foot in the grey hour before dawn, and did not look back at the house, because she had learned, at 17, exactly how much a backward glance cost a woman who could not afford to spend it. She walked the 6 miles to Fenbrook, and took a room above the chandler's shop that Mrs. Pruitt's widowed sister kept, and for 4 days she told herself, with the particular stubbornness of the thoroughly wronged, that she wanted nothing further to do with Ravensmere, its duke, or its books. On the 5th morning a boy came running with a note in Mrs. Pruitt's own square hand, blotted twice with haste. The solicitor, Mr. Pell, had written to say his arrival was moved forward a full 10 days, to the coming Michaelmas, on account of pressing business elsewhere in the summer, and that same night the old Duchess had been found collapsed at her writing desk, breathing shallow, her physician summoned at 2 in the morning and still, at dawn. Uncertain what ailed her beyond a general and worsening weakness no illness of the season could account for. Verity read the note twice, and then a 3rd time, and felt every careful wall she had built in 4 days of wounded pride come down at once, because whatever else was true, whatever Bellamy had made of her name, Augusta Traherne had been kind to her when kindness cost the old woman nothing to withhold, and a debt like that did not go unpaid, merely because the household that owed the kindness back had turned her out of doors. She sat with her father's account book open on her knees until the candle burned to nothing, running her thumb down 8 quarters of careful, coded figures, and understood, with the cold clarity of a woman who has finally stopped flinching from her own conclusions, exactly what the £4, 6 shillings had been paying for all along. Not carelessness, not error, but a slow and steady bleeding of the estate's income into Osric Bellamy's own accounts, quarter upon patient quarter. The theft small enough each time to escape a busy man's notice, and large enough, compounded over years, to answer for a McElmus audit that would otherwise have found him out a decade sooner. She thought of the tonic tray and the old Duchess's failing hands, and a single terrible question rose in her and would not be put down. What a man capable of years of quiet theft might be capable of, faced at last with 10 fewer days than he had planned on to cover it. She did not wait for an invitation back through Ravensmere's front door. She went instead, before first light, to the kitchen entrance, where Mrs. Pruitt let her in without a word, only a fierce, flower-dusted embrace that said more than 8 years of the housekeeper's speeches combined, and together, by the light of a single shielded candle. They went through the estate office while the house slept, Verity's coded tallies laid open beside the public ledgers, until close to 3 in the morning Mrs. Pruitt's blunt fingers found, behind a loose stone in the old fireplace surround that Bellamy had used as his private strong-box since his father's day, a small black day book bound in worn calfskin, filled corner to corner in Bellamy's own unmistakable hand with the true figures, the real rents, the real sales, the real £4 6 shillings and every other sum like it, set down honestly, because even a thief, it seemed, could not resist keeping one true account somewhere, if only to admire the size of what he had taken. It was Gideon who found them there at dawn, having not slept at all, having ridden twice past the chandler's shop in Fenbrook in the night only to lose his nerve each time at the door. And he stood in the doorway of his own estate office and looked at Verity with the black day book open in her lap, and 8 years and 4 days of misjudgment plain on his face. "I was wrong," he said, "and I have no excuse for it that does not shame me to say aloud." "Then do not say it aloud," she said. "Say it to your grandmother, before witnesses, on Michaelmas Day, when Mr. Pell arrives to open the books, because that, your grace, is the only place a wrong like this is properly paid." Bellamy, informed by his own frightened clerk that the Duke had been seen entering the office at dawn, spent that same morning at the hearth in his own lodgings, burning what papers he could reach. His hands, for the first time in 8 years of soft-voiced composure, visibly unsteady, his signet ring turning on a finger gone white at the knuckle. Michaelmas Day came in bright and cold, the first true frost silvering the lawns before the sun burned it away, and the library at Ravensmere Hall filled, by 10 o'clock, with more witnesses than it had held in a generation. Miss Josiah Pell down from London with his spectacles and his patient, incorruptible manner. The Dowager Duchess propped upright in her chair, grey, but stubbornly present. Her cane planted before her like a standard, Lady Cordelia Wynne, come uninvited and curious, and Mr. Silas Grey beside her, looking, for the first time since anyone had known him, faintly unwell. The household ranged along the walls the way a jury ranges itself without ever being asked. Bellamy stood near the window in his best coat, cuffs turned back their precise inch, and smiled his gentle smile at the room as though he had called the meeting himself. Mr. Pell opened the public ledgers first, methodically, column by column, and found them, as they had always been found, in perfect order, and it was Gideon, standing at his grandmother's shoulder, who said, into the small silence that followed, read the 5th column of the Lady Day Quarter once more, Mr. Pell, and set it beside this, and nodded to Verity, who came forward, and the room, sensing something it could not yet name, went very still, carrying her father's brass-cornered book in one hand and Bellamy's black day-book in the other. Bellamy's smile did not move, but his hand went, of its own accord, to straighten a cuff that did not need it. "A curious pair of exhibits," he said, "from a woman who cannot, I am reliably informed, speak. She can," Augusta Traherne said, "before anyone else could, her cane striking the floor once, hard, she has chosen, for 8 years, not to." "I find I no longer wonder why, Mr. Bellamy, watching your face just now." Verity set the 2 books side by side on the long table beneath the window's cold morning light, opened them to the same quarter, and said, her voice steady, unhurried, the first words most of that room had ever heard her speak, and all the more forceful for their 8 years of silence behind them. £4, 6 shillings, entered here as roof repair at Aldecott, that was never done, and entered here, in Mr. Bellamy's own hand, as paid to himself. The same sum, the same quarter, 11 times running. "A still tongue keeps a safe head, Mrs., Pruitt always told me. I have kept mine safe a long while on that advice. I find I no longer need it half so much as Mr. Bellamy needs his." Pell examined the 2 books, side by side, in a silence that stretched long enough for the frost outside to begin dripping from the eaves, and then looked up and said only, "The hands match," which was, in its quiet way, more devastating than any accusation could have been. It was Gideon who turned then to the physician waiting uneasily by the door, and asked the one question that broke the last man in the room still standing on false ground. "Mr. Fenwick, what is in the Duchess's nightly tonic that Mr. Bellamy has fetched and mixed himself these 2 years past, when for 30 years before that the apothecary's own boy delivered it, the apothecary's assistant, summoned at Verity's own quiet insistence the night before, went the colour of old tallow, and said, in a rush, that Mr. Bellamy had been adding, twice weekly, a tincture meant only for sleeplessness, in doses far beyond what any physician would sanction, and had paid handsomely for the silence of anyone who asked why. Bellamy's composure went at last, all at once, the way ice goes on a pond already thawed beneath, not into rage, but into something smaller and sadder, his hand rising to cover his eyes, his voice, when it came, no longer gentle but simply tired. "My father managed these accounts 30 years, and was thanked with a cottage and a pension too small to bury him decently," he said. "I managed them 12 years more, and was never once asked to sit at the table where the money I balanced was spent. I did not set out to hurt her." He did not finish the sentence, and no one in the room pressed him to. Gideon looked at him a long moment, and something in his face, the same face that had gone hard as flint over a stolen miniature 4 days before, settled instead into something almost like grief. "You will go abroad," he said, "with an allowance sufficient to live honestly, and not 1 shilling more, and you will not return to this county while my grandmother lives, because it is her safety I am buying with this mercy, cousin, and not your comfort. I could ruin you before every magistrate in the shire. I find I would rather simply be rid of you." Bellamy did not argue. He only turned his garnet ring once more, and bowed very correctly to the old Duchess, and went out into the cold bright morning a smaller man than he had come in. It was 3 weeks later, in the same walled garden, where a lark had once mended under Verity's hands, that Gideon found her again at dusk, the last of the year's roses gone brown at the edges around them, and he did not begin with a question this time. "I told you once I did not need your voice to know your mind," he said. I find I was wrong about that too, in the end, though it is the one wrongness I do not regret. I would like to hear it anyway. Not because Ravensmere needs an heir, and not because you have nowhere else to go, mister. Pell has already seen your father's name cleared of every debt that was never truly his, and settled a competence on you besides. So you are, Miss Ashworth, entirely free to walk out that gate and want for nothing. I am asking because I find the house unbearably quiet when you are not in it, which is, I grant you, a strange complaint to make of a woman famous for her silence. Say it plainly, she said, though she was smiling, the first wholly unguarded smile he had ever seen her wear. I love you, he said, and I will go on loving you whether you answer me in words, or on that slate you still, I notice, have not troubled to leave behind, because I have learnt at last that a person's worth was never carried in their voice at all. But I would like the words, if you are willing to spend them. Silence was a coin I spent on purpose, every year of it, she said, and I find I would like, for once in my life, to spend something on purpose that is not silence. Yes, Gideon, I will marry you, because I wish it, and for no other reason, and I will thank you to remember that I have said so freely, since I spent 8 years proving I could not be made to say anything at all. They were married before the month was out, quietly, in the small stone chapel at Fenbrook, with no more than 30 souls present. Mrs. Pruitt, weeping into a handkerchief she pretended, unconvincingly, was needed only for her nose, and Augusta Traherne restored these 3 weeks to her old sharp self, tapping her cane in place of applause when the vicar pronounced them wed. Lady Cordelia Wynne, who had come to the tribunal expecting to see a rival humbled, and left instead having quietly returned the miniature she'd once eyed with such contempt, sent her own wedding gift with a note that read, "In full, I was wrong about you, and I find I am glad of it," and was, within the year, happily settled with the elder Mr. Pell's widowed nephew, a match no one, least of all Cordelia, had seen coming. Silas Grey went home to his own county chastened and unmarried, and was heard thereafter to speak rather less of comfortable, quiet wives. Osric Bellamy wrote once a year from a small house near Calais, letters that grew over time, less bitter and more simply sad. And Gideon read every one, and answered perhaps every third. A full year turned, and on a bright morning, at the very start of summer, the Duchess of Ravensmere walked out into the walled garden with a small boy on her hip, her son not yet 2 years old, and already, his grandmother swore, possessed of his father's stillness and his mother's watching eyes, and found a lark singing in the very same corner where, one August morning, she had first forgotten, for a few unguarded seconds, to be silent. She did not think of it as forgetting any more. She set the boy down among the roses and crouched to watch the bird with him, and when Gideon came to stand behind her, his hand warm on her shoulder, she said, without needing to lower her voice for anyone, "A still tongue kept me safe a long while. Love, I find I like a full one better." And he laughed, freely, easily, the sound no longer rare at all, and the lark, unbothered by either of them, went on singing into the bright new morning as though it had never once needed telling that it would live. If this story warmed you, the particular warmth of watching someone hand their whole voice, at last, to a person who had already earned it in silence, then stay a little while longer by the fire with me. The kettle's on, the chair across from mine is empty and waiting, and I would love nothing more than to hear which moment stayed with you. The lark in the hedge, the day-book laid open in the cold morning light, or that last small line about a full tongue. Tell me in the comments, and while you're there, Keep a place by this hearth by subscribing, so I'll know to save you a seat next time I've a story worth the telling. Until then, be gentle with the quiet ones in your own life. You never do know what they're carrying, or what they might yet say, if only someone troubles to listen. Sleep well.